Hi everybody, it's Tahir here from Oderbach Permaculture Farm, and I'm standing in one of our food forests on the farm, and this food forest is located in what we call Zone 2, which brings me to the subject of this next presentation. So the previous presentations we had a good deep dive into the permaculture principles, the 12 Holmgren principles, and now we are going to explore permaculture zoning, which is a very important and fundamental design principle in permaculture. It's what I call the 13th principle. And so, because the subject is so critical to good permaculture design and understanding how permaculture functions, we're going to do this in two presentations. This one, the first, we're going to look at the concept of zoning in permaculture. We're going to define it very clearly. And then in the next presentation, we're going to go through each zone in turn and look at the characteristics of each zone and look at what elements and systems are best suited to each zone. Okay, so enjoy. Hi everybody, welcome to the next presentation in our exploration of what is permaculture and the deep dive into the permaculture concept. So in the previous presentation we looked at the 12 David Holmgren permaculture principles in significant detail, and I think that by now you guys have started to develop a pretty comprehensive understanding of what permaculture is all about. Okay, and so what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at the Bill Mollison principle of efficient energy planning in specific reference to the concept of permaculture zones. Now I'm sure many of you have encountered this concept of zones in permaculture. It's a fundamental design strategy. And David Holmgren didn't really incorporate the concept of zones into his 12 principles at all. And generally, from a permaculture point of view, this principle of Bill Mollison has been shifted into the design process aspect of permaculture. So it really comes out in the way we design. But my feeling is that it is has such a profound influence on the way that we understand permaculture and the way we see permaculture systems from a ground level, from a spatial arrangement, that it's a foundational concept. Okay, and so I see it as the 13th principle, and well worth exploring in some depth right at the beginning of our journey into permaculture. Okay, because you will see as we go along into the different themes of permaculture and into the process of permaculture design that this zone planning system comes up again and again and again, and I think it's a foundational concept, and so we're going to have a look at it. Okay, so what we see here on the slide are David's 12 principles, which we've just been through, and then we have Bill's principles here. All right, and many of these are inbuilt into these 12, but this efficient energy planning isn't really, although the ultimate result of the application of the 12 principles is efficient energy planning. It is the concept of self-regulation and syntropy that is always making more energy available due to efficiencies within the system. Okay, so what this particular principle looks at is how we arrange the elements in our system
in relation to each other on the ground to be more efficient in the way they exchange. So it's not just about making as many connections as possible between elements, it's also about the distance that elements are placed from one another, okay, and which elements do we cluster together and which ones do we keep apart. All right. We are looking at a conceptual model that is expressed in a concentric form, like a series of ripples, okay? And at the center of the model, okay, because it is a model. Let me just move myself out the way. But at the center of the model is the most intensive aspect of the site, where the people spend most of their time, all right? So that's generally the building or the dwelling. And then, so that would be termed zone 0. And then there are 5 other land use zones that radiate out from the central zone, okay? And as you go out, the intensity of land use diminishes. And the size of area under cultivation or under management increases. So your zone 0 and your zone 1 are going to be the smallest footprint areas, but with the most intensity, most diversity, most activity. While zone 5, for example, which is the outer edge of the system, will be the biggest area of land and have the least management and the least intensity. And in most cases, it's just wild nature. So we've got this concentric zone that is a gradient from high intensity to low intensity. And we can see it here from a side profile. Okay, so you can see as we go along, it's like a ripple, a big drop of water falls into a still pond, and you have this explosion in the center, and then of intensity, and then it dissipates as the force of the water drop dissipates as it moves away. Okay, so there it is. Okay, and here you can see that the intensity dissipates over distance. All right. And this is the zone pattern language. It's the way we represent the zone concept and pattern. And so how we place elements into the zone model has got to do with 3 laws of zoning, okay? And so they apply to every element that we want to bring into the design, whether it's a vegetable garden, a food forest, cattle, bees, a nursery, a workshop, those elements. You will test where they need to go by virtue of applying the 3 laws, okay? And the 3 laws are quite simple and easy to understand. First one is, how many times do you need to use the element? You know, how many times do you have to visit the element to harvest or use it? Okay, so how often do you have to go to the vegetable garden to harvest food? All right. Relative to, say, how many times you have to go out to a woodlot to harvest timber. There's a difference. The second law is, how much service do they need? So how much management and maintenance do the elements need? So once again, if we look at a vegetable garden, it's a high maintenance system. And we compare that to a woodlot, which is a very low maintenance system. So the amount of maintenance in a vegetable garden is going to be much higher. All right. And then the third aspect is about how much space the elements need. All right. So a vegetable garden tends to be a very compact, small-scale system. It's very productive and intensive, the high management demand. While a woodlot is a very extensive system. Right? It uses a lot of space and a lot of trees. Doesn't need much management and is seldom harvested. Once a year or so for firewood, or once every 15 to 20 years for structural timbers. Okay, so we would then place the vegetable garden closer into the center, and we'd have the woodlot further out in the zone model. because it wouldn't make sense from an energy efficiency perspective to have the woodlot close to the center, because why? We don't need to engage with it much at all, while the vegetable garden demands a lot of engagement and it doesn't use much space. So it makes more sense from an energy efficiency perspective to have it into the inner zones. So we have these 6 zones that radiate out, okay. And each zone decreases in management requirements and in intensity of production, and needs more space to enable the elements that are in there to self-regulate and function. So you can see the zone 5 is very big relative to the zone 0. And so this is a conceptual model. It's something that we see from a concept. It's a way of understanding how to put things together. So we have zone 0, 1 and 2 is our central high intensity zones, and then 3, 4 and 5 as our outer less intense zones with bigger footprints. And so they will also scale according to the size land you have. And you can see here in this little image that there are certain elements that naturally fit themselves into the zones. It's almost like a template that you can bring into an environment and know more or less from a perspective of zoning. We're going to see these elements in zone 1, these elements in zone 2, and these elements in zone 3. So they're characteristic elements that actually naturally go into each zone. And so the system from a design perspective is very useful, because it already starts to arrange your design for you based on this principle. Okay. But what we've got to understand is that it's not dogma, okay? It's not about having a concentric zone model on the ground. You know, the only time that would probably be relevant would be in an absolutely flat environment where you've got a lot of land and you're farming. But most sites are totally unique in land form and size and function. So some sites will have a zone 1 around the zone 0, and that will be it, like a small urban plot. While other sites, maybe because their function is different, it's a retreat, they'll have a zone 0 and in a zone 5, because there's no requirement to produce anything. So it's not a production-based system, so there's no need for production zones. So the selection of zones has got everything to do with the nature of the property and the function of the property. And so the zones will also shape themselves into the property appropriately. So the zones are placed according to landscape characteristics. And so what you'll have is, like, larger farms will have 5 zones. Okay. And the smaller your property gets, the less likely you're going to have all the zones in there. It's very much dependent on the context. And sometimes you will have more than one of a specific zone. So many designs have 3 or 4 zone 0s, because they're 3 or 4, like a guest house farm have a few zone 0s, for example. So here in this model, there are a few zone 3s. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 zone 3s, and they're labeled as such. Okay, and the reason that they are defined apart is that the function of the land use is different in each zone 3. And once we go a bit further into this presentation, we'll understand why that is. Okay, because there are elements and systems that go in zone 3 are quite different. So you'll have a woodlot silver pasture system integrating timber and cattle, and in another instance you will have open grazing. They're 2 different systems, but they're all zone 3 in characteristic. Okay, so we're not going into this trying to fit the concentric zone model into reality. We are just applying it in an appropriate manner that is relevant to circumstance. Okay, relevant to the human and landscape context. And this model actually emerged from the traditional village layout. I don't think it's necessarily a village layout that is universal, but you see it pretty common in South America, even in Africa, Europe, and I've seen examples of this particular pattern in Asia as well. So when you look at a traditional village, okay, you will see that there are certain zones. So you'll have a central market commercial area in the traditional village, and there'll be a church or a mosque or a temple there. And there'll be a village square, and there will also be administrative buildings. And then immediately around that, clustered, are the residential areas. And in many cases, the residential areas were located above a shop, so there was also a level of really small business and commerce here. And then each little residence had its own strip of private land. And there generally people kept chickens and rabbits, grew vegetables and fruit, and it was a self-reliance zone. And then around that, what we would have would be the commons, okay? The shared land, which had different functions. There was the production of agricultural level resources like grains, for example, which were done collectively. There was large-scale grazing lands which were managed collectively, and then there were wilderness areas, forests and lakes and things that were owned collectively, all out in the commons. Okay, and so this particular model set the foundation for permaculture, and permaculture has just scaled it up, refined it, and modernized it. Okay, we've got a lot more information, and our society is a lot more sophisticated now than it used to be. But you can see it here. Here's a medieval village, and the core of the village is centered along the road. And then you can see each little homestead has its own small little farm, what I'd call homesteading, vegetable gardens, fruit gardens. And around that you'd see the staple food cropping, the commercial cash cropping, and then the wilderness. Okay, and so there was a bit of a concentric zone model that would then expand out in a ripple effect until it touched on the expanding ripple effects of other little villages clustering in amongst each other. And you see this particularly in Asia and in Latin Europe too, very densely settled areas, lots of small villages close to one another, separated from each other by each village's commons. Okay. And everybody would have commons rights. And so permaculture has adopted this ancient system for energy efficiency purposes. Okay, and you can think about it like this. So here's a permaculture design taken from Bill Mollison's Intro to Permaculture. And you see the house zone 0, and then clustered around the house are the vegetable gardens, because they serve the house directly and they need a lot of attention, and they don't take too much space. There's a very compact, very diverse zone 1 now, right there by the house. And that's because you're visiting the vegetable garden at least 3 times a day to harvest and cultivate. And so it makes sense to have it right at the kitchen door rather than at the bottom of the garden. And where this whole concept of having it at the bottom of the garden starts to fall short from an energy efficiency perspective is, You know, if you are going to that garden at least 3 times a day, and that's a minimum, and say the veggie garden's 30 meters away from the house, okay, this having the vegetable garden out of sight, out of mind is very much a Victorian evolution, a status symbol whereby landowners could show their wealth through ornamental systems. They were so wealthy they didn't need to grow their own food. So, and the other aspect is out of sight, out of mind. If you're not able to observe something constantly, you lose track of it. And so systems that need a lot of management are always best clustered in where you spend a lot of time, because you can observe them and you can notice things that change and shift every day, and you can engage and manage appropriately. Which is why in permaculture our vegetable gardens are right by the house, okay? Because we can pay them attention, and it doesn't take much to go outside and harvest. And this is, you know, this is what we're looking at now from the permaculture landscape perspective. This is how the garden looks. Here's the house, here's the garden. This is David Holmgren's property in New South Wales. Okay, so I mean that's the basic concept behind zoning. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to explore each zone in turn. So that we'll look at the 6 zones. We'll look at them from the perspective of what is the characteristic of the zone, and then what elements can we expect to see in the zone. All right, and so we'll do that in a separate presentation. We'll have a look at the inner zones first. Zone 0, 1 and 2, and we'll look at the outer zones, because they're different. You know, the inner zones are very much self-reliance, and the outer zones are very much agriculture. All right.